The rain pelted the windows of the sprawling Malibu mansion as Margaret Hayes stood in her pristine kitchen, steam rising from her morning coffee. At 42, she had everything a woman could want: a successful millionaire ex-husband who still provided well, a beautiful home overlooking the Pacific, and the respect that came with being married to Richard Hayes of Hayes Restaurant Group. The phone rang, piercing the morning quiet. Hayes residence. Margaret speaking. Mrs. Hayes, this is Dr. Reynolds from Cedar-Sinai Medical Center. Your husband asked me to call you directly. Margaret's coffee mug froze halfway to her lips. Something in the doctor's tone made her stomach clench. Is everything all right? Is Richard hurt? Ma'am, your husband is here with a young woman. She's in labor, and he's listed as the father on the intake forms. The coffee mug slipped from Margaret's hand, shattering against the marble counter. 22 years of marriage. 22 years of building Richard's empire alongside him. 22 years of believing she was the only woman in his life. I'm sorry, what did you say? The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Mrs. Hayes, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. What's the woman's name? Ashley Chen. She's 24 years old. Ashley, the new secretary Richard had hired 6 months ago. The one he said was just temporary help during the busy season. Margaret's mind raced through the late nights, the weekend business trips, the distant looks across the dinner table. All the signs she'd ignored because she trusted her husband completely. Doctor, is there anything else I need to know? Ma'am, your husband has asked that all communications go through his attorney from this point forward. I'm sorry to be the bearer of this news. The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down carefully, her hands surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. 22 years, she whispered to herself. And this is how it ends. Not with a conversation, not with an explanation, with a phone call from a stranger. Thunder rumbled in the distance, matching the storm building inside her. Margaret moved through her house like a ghost, touching surfaces that suddenly felt foreign. The Italian marble Richard had insisted on for the renovation, the original Picasso he'd bought at auction last spring, the custom kitchen where she'd hosted dozens of dinner parties for his business associates, charming investors and smoothing over his occasional social blunders. She stopped at their wedding photo on the grand piano. 24-year-old Margaret in vintage lace, 26-year-old Richard in his father's tuxedo. They'd had nothing then except dreams and a tiny apartment above Richard's first restaurant. She remembered working 16-hour days right beside him, designing logos, managing books, smooth-talking investors when he was too proud to ask for help. Those early years flashed through her memory like a slideshow. Margaret had been the one to suggest expanding from a single restaurant to a chain. She'd negotiated their first major loan when the bank initially said no. When Richard's pride almost cost them a crucial deal with Harrison Industries, Margaret had arranged a dinner with Edward Harrison's wife that sealed the partnership. The phone rang again, making her jump. Hayes residence. Maggie, honey, it's Susan. I just heard the most ridiculous rumor, and I had to call you directly. Susan Mitchell, her closest friend from the country club. Margaret's stomach dropped. If Susan had heard, everyone in their social circle knew. Please tell me it's not true about Richard and that little secretary of his. It's true, Susan. Oh, honey. Oh, my God. What are you going to do? I honestly don't know. An hour ago, I was planning our anniversary dinner for next month. Now I'm apparently getting divorced. You need a lawyer, Maggie, a good one. Don't let him steamroll you like he does everyone else in business. Margaret had always admired Richard's business ruthlessness. Now she realized she was about to be on the receiving end of it. The doorbell rang. Susan, someone's at the door. I'll call you back. She walked to the front entrance, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. Through the glass panels, she could see a young man in a suit holding a manila envelope. Mrs. Margaret Hayes. Yes. You've been served. Ma'am, divorce papers. Have a good day. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, holding the envelope that would redefine her entire life. Her name was typed on a white label in block letters, Margaret Elizabeth Hayes. Respondent. Respondent. Not even her name. just a legal designation for what she'd become in Richard's eyes. 22 years, she whispered, and I'm just a respondent. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, her wedding ring catching the light as papers scattered across the entry table. The legal language was cold and clinical, reducing their entire marriage to assets and liabilities. But one line made her blood run cold. Richard was asking for sole ownership of all business assets, including Hayes Restaurant Group, Hayes Entertainment Holdings, and Hayes Development Corporation. Everything they'd built together, he was claiming as his alone. In exchange, she would receive the Malibu house, $50,000 monthly in spousal support for 5 years, and her personal vehicle. After 2 decades of partnership, Richard was offering her crumbs from the empire she'd helped create. Margaret walked to Richard's study, a room she rarely entered, his domain, filled with awards and photos from business achievements they'd earned together. She sat in his leather chair and pulled out business files, determined to understand exactly what they were fighting over. Hidden in the back of a file drawer, she found documents she'd never seen before. Partnership agreements with Harrison Industries, loan applications from their early years, articles of incorporation, all with her name on them as co-founder and equal partner. Equal partner, she read aloud. I'm not just his wife, I'm his business partner. For the next hour, Margaret combed through 20 years of documents, bank signature cards with both their names, insurance policies listing her as beneficiary of business assets, legal papers establishing her as half-owner of everything Richard was trying to claim. The picture became crystal clear. Legally, she owned 50% of the restaurant empire, the development company, the entertainment holdings, all of it. Richard's divorce papers were asking her to voluntarily give up assets that were already half hers. He's trying to steal my own company from me, she realized, anger replacing shock. Margaret thought about the phone call from the hospital. Richard having a baby with his secretary while she worked 60-hour weeks to build their business. Him sending divorce papers through a process server instead of having the courage to face her directly. The narcissistic abuse of making her feel like she was nothing more than an expensive housewife when she'd been his equal partner all along. Thunder crashed outside, but Margaret felt calmer than she had all morning. She wasn't a victim of her millionaire ex-husband's betrayal. She was a businesswoman who just discovered she had more power than she'd ever realized. Not this time, Richard, she said firmly. Not this time. Margaret's first call was to Catherine Morrison, the attorney whose reputation for destroying unfaithful husbands was legendary among the country club set. Women whispered her name like a prayer when their marriages fell apart. Law Offices of Catherine Morrison. This is Margaret Hayes. I need to speak with Catherine immediately about my divorce from Richard Hayes. Mrs. Morrison is in court today, but she asked me to tell you she'll see you at 5 o'clock if you called. She was expecting my call. Word travels fast in certain circles. Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Morrison will see you at 5. Margaret looked at the clock. 3:30. She had 90 minutes to prepare for war. Her second call was to Harrison Industries. Edward Harrison had been Richard's biggest business rival for 20 years. But he'd always been respectful to Margaret. More than respectful. At business dinners, she'd caught him watching her with something that looked like genuine admiration for her intelligence. Harrison Industries, how may I direct your call? This is Margaret Hayes. I need to speak with Edward Harrison immediately. One moment, please. Mrs. Hayes. The hold music seemed to last forever before Edward's familiar voice came on the line. Margaret, I heard about Richard's situation. I'm sorry this is happening to you. Edward's voice was exactly as she remembered it. Deep, thoughtful, with a slight Boston accent that spoke of old money and older manners. But there was something else in his tone today. Respect, but also interest. Edward, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. In all our business dealings over the years, who were you really negotiating with, Richard or me? A long pause. When Edward spoke again, his voice was careful but truthful. Margaret, you were always the brains of that operation. Richard's got charm and ambition, but you understand business strategy in a way that can't be taught. Half the deals we've made over the years succeeded because you were managing the details Richard missed. Then I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. I'm about to become available as a business partner. Richard's trying to cut me out of companies that are legally half mine. I think you and I should discuss some possibilities. Margaret, are you asking me to help you fight your millionaire ex-husband's divorce settlement? I'm asking you to help me claim what's already mine. Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. I'll send a car. Her third call was to Gloria Stevens, the sharp accountant who'd been doing the Hayes family taxes for 15 years. Maggie, honey, I was wondering when you'd call. Gloria, I need every financial document you have on Richard's businesses. Everything. Already pulled them. I'll messenger them over within the hour. You knew this was coming. Honey, I've been doing taxes for cheating husbands for 30 years. I saw the warning signs in Richard's filings 2 years ago. Personal expenses charged to business accounts. Trips for two that weren't with you. Hotel bills that didn't match his claimed business travel. Margaret felt sick. How did I miss all this? You were trusting. There's a difference. Now, you want my advice. Take him for everything he's worth. He's been underreporting income, overreporting expenses, and hiding assets offshore. I can prove it. Hidden assets. 3 offshore accounts, 2 properties in the Cayman Islands, and a yacht registered in Panama. Your name's not on any of them, but they were purchased with community property funds. Margaret's pulse quickened. How much are we talking about? Conservatively, Richard's worth about $50 million more than what he's claiming in the divorce papers. Margaret sat down hard. $50 million, that should be half mine. $50 million, that is half yours. You want to play hardball with your millionaire ex-husband? I just gave you the ammunition. Send me everything. Gloria, every document, every receipt, every suspicious transaction. Already on its way. Give them hell. Honey. As Margaret waited for the documents to arrive, she thought about the universal dilemma she was facing. How many successful women had stood in this exact position, discovering that their partners had been systematically undermining them while they focused on being supportive wives? She thought about Susan, who'd given up her teaching career to support her husband's political ambitions. Janet, who'd sold her successful boutique when her husband's job required them to move. Patricia, who'd dissolved her catering business because her husband thought it was too demanding. How many brilliant women had convinced themselves they were just helpers in someone else's story, when they were actually the main characters in their own? How many had forgotten their own power while they were busy building someone else's dreams? Margaret walked to the mirror in the hallway and looked at herself honestly for the first time in years. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing herself as Margaret Hayes, businesswoman, and started seeing herself as Mrs. Richard Hayes, wife. She let him define her value based on her role in his life instead of her contributions to their shared empire. Not anymore, she said to her reflection. I'm taking back what's mine. The doorbell rang, and Margaret signed for a thick package from Gloria's office. Inside were 20 years of financial records that painted a picture of systematic deception. Richard hadn't just been unfaithful to their marriage. He'd been stealing from their partnership. But as Margaret spread the documents across the dining table, she felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. For months, she'd sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify what. Now she knew. Her instincts had been right all along. The narcissistic abuse hadn't just been emotional. Richard had been gaslighting her about their financial reality, making her believe she was dependent on his generosity when she was actually entitled to half of everything as his legal business partner. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Susan. How are you holding up, sweetie? She typed back, better than expected. I just remembered who I used to be before I became someone's wife. The law offices of Catherine Morrison occupied the top floor of a Century City high-rise. Margaret had heard stories about Catherine for years. The attorney who'd taken down 3 tech billionaires in divorce court. The woman who'd made Morrison Ed a verb among unfaithful husbands throughout California. Catherine Morrison was nothing like Margaret had expected. Mid-50s, silver hair in a perfect bob, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. But her eyes were warm, almost maternal, until they focused on business. Then they became laser sharp. Margaret, sit down. Tell me everything. For the next 30 minutes, Margaret laid out the whole story. The phone call from the hospital, Richard's baby with his secretary, The divorce papers claiming she was just a dependent spouse. The discovery of the partnership documents proving she was actually co-owner of everything. You found partnership agreements naming you as equal owner. Every business entity, equal partners from day one. And your accountant has evidence of hidden assets worth 50 million, offshore accounts, foreign properties, systematic underreporting of income. Catherine leaned back in her chair and smiled. Not a pleasant smile. The smile of a predator who just detected weakness in her prey. Margaret, your millionaire ex-husband just made the biggest mistake of his life. What do you mean? He filed for divorce claiming you were entitled to spousal support as a dependent spouse. But you're not a dependent spouse. You're a business partner who's been systematically defrauded by her co-owner. Margaret felt confused. I don't understand the difference. Spousal support has limits based on lifestyle and duration of marriage. Business fraud has penalties, criminal penalties. Catherine pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Richard could face charges for embezzlement, tax fraud, and concealing marital assets. But more importantly for you, he could lose everything. Not just half of everything, all of it. All of it. California law is very clear about fraudulent business practices during marriage. If I can prove Richard systematically defrauded you as his business partner, the court can award you full ownership of all business assets as compensation for damages. Margaret felt dizzy. This morning she'd been facing financial dependence on a man who'd betrayed her. Now she was potentially looking at ownership of a $50 million empire. But I need to ask you something. Margaret, are you prepared for war? What kind of war? Richard is going to fight dirty. He'll try to destroy your reputation, claim you were an uninvolved housewife, maybe even accuse you of having affairs. The narcissistic abuse will escalate beyond anything you've experienced. Are you strong enough to weather that? Margaret thought about the 22 years she'd spent building Richard's dreams, the dinner parties where she'd charmed resistant investors, the late nights she'd spent balancing books when his drinking affected his judgment, the times she'd covered for his mistakes and let him take credit for her solutions. Catherine, I've been weathering Richard's storms for 2 decades. The only difference now is that I'm fighting back. Good, because we're going to destroy him systematically and legally. By the time we're finished, he'll be lucky to own a food truck. Catherine explained their strategy. Emergency motions to freeze all business assets, forensic accounting to trace every hidden dollar, criminal referrals for tax fraud and forgery, a media campaign to position Margaret as the wrong business partner rather than the abandoned wife. The key is changing the narrative, Catherine explained. Society loves stories about women achieving financial independence after narcissistic abuse. We're going to make you the hero of your own story instead of the victim of his. As Margaret left Catherine's office, she felt more alive than she had in years. For the first time since the phone call from the hospital, she wasn't thinking about what Richard had taken from her. She was thinking about what she was going to build without him. Her phone rang as she waited for the elevator. Margaret, it's Edward Harrison. I hope you don't mind me calling directly. Not at all. Edward. I've been thinking about our conversation. I'd like to move up our dinner to tonight if possible. There are some developments in the business community that you should know about. What kind of developments? Word is already spreading about Richard's situation. Several of his major investors are nervous about the leadership transition. If you're serious about claiming your stake in the business, we need to move quickly before he tries to restructure everything to cut you out. Margaret felt a chill. Can he do that? Not legally, if you're truly equal partners. But Richard's never been particularly concerned with legality when it comes to protecting his interests. Tonight works for me. Where should we meet? I'll pick you up at 7. And Margaret, bring copies of those partnership documents. I have some ideas about how to use them. After hanging up, Margaret realized she was smiling for the first time all day. Not the forced smile she'd perfected for business dinners, but a genuine expression of anticipation. She was about to stop being Mrs. Richard Hayes and start being Margaret Hayes. CEO. The elevator doors opened, and Margaret stepped inside, catching her reflection in the polished steel. She looked different already, stronger, more focused, like a woman who just remembered she had choices. Welcome back, she whispered to her reflection. Edward Harrison's driver picked Margaret up at 7 sharp in a black sedan that whispered money and discretion. The restaurant was Lumiere, the most exclusive establishment in Beverly Hills. Margaret had eaten there dozens of times with Richard for business dinners, but tonight felt completely different. When she was shown to the private dining room, Edward stood immediately, away from formal business functions. He looked less intimidating and more human. His silver hair was slightly mussed, and he'd loosened his tie. Most importantly, he looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room rather than someone's attractive accessory. "Margaret, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice. Thank you for thinking this was urgent enough to accelerate." They ordered wine and made initial small talk about mutual acquaintances and the business climate, but Margaret could feel the undercurrent of something significant building between them. "Tell me about your situation, Margaret, not the public version, the real situation." Margaret found herself explaining everything with a clarity she hadn't expected. The systematic deception, the hidden assets, Catherine Morrison's strategy for claiming full ownership of Richard's empire. Edward listened without interrupting, his expression growing more intrigued with each detail. "So you're not just getting divorced, you're potentially taking over Richard's entire operation? That's the plan, assuming we can prove fraud and forgery? And what happens after you destroy your millionaire ex-husband?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She'd been so focused on fighting Richard that she hadn't thought about what came next. "I honestly hadn't thought that far ahead. May I make a suggestion? Please." Harrison Industries has been trying to expand into hospitality for years. Richard's never been willing to sell or partner with us because of our competitive history. "But you might be—" Margaret's mind raced. Edward wasn't just offering to buy her out. He was offering her a chance to build something even bigger than what she'd had with Richard. "You want to partner with me? Equal partnership. You bring the hospitality expertise and established business infrastructure. I bring capital for expansion and my distribution network. Together, we could create the largest hospitality empire on the West Coast." "Edward, are you offering me a business partnership or something more?" His eyes met hers directly. "Right now, I'm offering you a business partnership, but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about more." Margaret studied Edward's face. He was handsome in a quiet way that Richard had never been. Distinguished rather than flashy. Successful without needing constant validation. Most importantly, he was talking to her like an equal rather than like someone who needed his protection. "I'm still married, Edward. Not for long, if your attorney is as good as her reputation suggests. Even after the divorce, I'll need time to figure out who I am outside of being Richard's wife. Margaret, I've waited 20 years to have dinner alone with you. I can wait a little longer." She laughed despite everything. 20 years. "The first time I met you and Richard, you were wearing a blue dress and arguing with him about his expansion timeline. You were right, by the way. He was moving too fast without adequate market research, but you made your point without making him look stupid in front of his investors. You remember what I was wearing? I remember thinking that Richard was the luckiest man alive, and he was too stupid to appreciate what he had." They talked for 3 more hours. About business strategy and expansion possibilities, about their children and their dreams, about the loneliness of being married to people who saw them as accessories rather than partners. When Edward's driver brought Margaret back to the Malibu house, she felt more like herself than she had in years. "Think about my offer, Margaret. The business partnership. I will, Edward. Yes. Thank you for seeing me. Really seeing me. Not just as Richard's wife. Margaret, you're impossible to overlook. The mystery is how Richard managed to take you for granted for so long." As the car pulled away, Margaret stood in her driveway looking up at the stars. 24 hours ago, her life had been destroyed by a phone call. Now it felt like the best chapters were just beginning. But as she walked toward the house, she noticed something that made her stomach clench. Richard's car was in the driveway. The front door opened before she could reach for her keys, and Richard stepped out. Even in the dim light, she could see the fury on his face. "Cozy dinner with my biggest competitor, Margaret." "Hello, Richard. I wasn't expecting you." "I bet you weren't. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I had dinner with a business associate to discuss future opportunities." "Business associate Margaret, You're my wife. You don't have business associates. You have my business associates. The possessiveness in his voice triggered something in Margaret. This was exactly the narcissistic abuse pattern she'd been blind to for years. Richard believing he owned not just her loyalty, but her right to independent relationships. Richard, you filed for divorce this morning. I think that changes our relationship somewhat. The divorce papers are a formality. Margaret, a way to restructure our assets for tax purposes. I never intended for you to start acting like some kind of independent businesswoman. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. Tax purposes, Richard. You had a baby with another woman. Ashley's situation is complicated. It doesn't change anything between us. It changes everything between us. Now, Margaret, you're not thinking clearly. Cancel whatever arrangement you've made with Harrison. We can work this out privately. What exactly are we working out, Richard? You sign the settlement papers as proposed. I handle the business restructuring. We both move on with dignity intact. Margaret realized this was her moment of choice. She could retreat back into being Mrs. Richard Hayes, grateful for whatever scraps he offered. Or she could step fully into being Margaret Hayes, equal partner and independent woman. Richard, I found the partnership documents. His face went pale. What partnership documents? Articles of incorporation naming me as co-founder and equal owner of every business entity you're claiming is solely yours. Those documents are 20 years old. Margaret, they're not relevant to current business structure. They're relevant to the divorce settlement that claims I'm entitled to spousal support instead of my 50% ownership stake. Richard's confident facade cracked. Margaret, you don't understand business law. I understand it well enough to know you've been committing fraud. Don't threaten me, Margaret. I'm not threatening you, Richard. I'm informing you that the war you started this morning is one you're going to lose. For the first time in their marriage, Richard looked at her with something resembling respect and fear. Margaret, let's go inside and discuss this rationally. There's nothing to discuss. My attorney will handle all future communications. Your attorney, Catherine Morrison. I'm sure you've heard of her. Richard's face went white. Every cheating husband in California knew Catherine Morrison's name. Margaret, Morrison is a piranha. She'll destroy both of us. She'll destroy you. Richard, I'm her client. Margaret walked past him toward the front door, and for the first time in 22 years, Richard Hayes stepped aside to let his wife pass. Margaret woke to her phone ringing at 6 in the morning. Catherine Morrison's voice was crisp and energized. Margaret, we have a problem and an opportunity. Richard's attorney filed an emergency motion claiming you're mentally unstable and seeking to place all business assets under court protection. Mentally unstable. It's a standard desperate move. He's claiming your dinner with Edward Harrison proves you're not capable of making rational business decisions. But here's the opportunity. He just legally acknowledged that you have business decision-making authority. You can't be mentally unfit to make business decisions about assets you don't own. Margaret felt her anger building. So what do? We filed a counter motion 30 minutes ago. Emergency hearing at 10 this morning. Richard's going to have to appear in court and explain why he thinks his business partner is suddenly incompetent. Business partner. That's how we're positioning you now. Not as his wife, but as his defrauded business partner. Margaret, get dressed and meet me at the courthouse. Today we start destroying your millionaire ex-husband piece by piece. While Margaret prepared for court, her phone exploded with calls. News of Richard's legal filing had leaked, and reporters were calling for comments. Susan called 3 times. Even Margaret's sister in Chicago had heard something on the business news. But the call that surprised her most came from Gloria, her accountant. Maggie, honey, you need to know something. Richard's been moving money since yesterday afternoon. What kind of money? Large transfers to offshore accounts. He's trying to hide assets before the court can freeze them. Can he do that? Not legally, and the electronic trail makes it easy to prove. But Maggie, we're talking about moving millions of dollars in hours. If he's this desperate, he's either more guilty than we thought or he knows something we don't. Margaret felt a chill. What could he know that we don't? I don't know, but I've got forensic accountants tracing every transaction. By the time you get to court, we'll have evidence of exactly how much he's trying to steal. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters when Margaret arrived. The story had exploded beyond business pages into general news. Millionaire's wife claims husband forged documents to hide assets was trending on social media. Catherine guided Margaret through the crowd without stopping for questions. Don't say anything to reporters. Let the evidence speak for itself. Inside the courtroom, Margaret saw Richard for the first time since their confrontation in the driveway. He looked smaller somehow, sitting next to his attorney. When their eyes met across the courtroom, his expression was pure hatred mixed with something that looked like desperation. Judge Patricia Williams was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen every dirty trick divorce attorneys could devise. This is an emergency hearing in the matter of Hayes versus Hayes. Mrs. Morrison, you filed the counter motion. Present your case. Catherine stood with the confidence of a woman who'd fought this battle dozens of times. Your Honor, my client has discovered that her husband has been systematically hiding marital assets and forging her signature on business documents for over 2 years. Mr. Hayes's claim that Mrs. Hayes is mentally unfit is actually an admission that she has business decision-making authority, which contradicts his divorce filing claiming she was merely a dependent spouse. Catherine presented the evidence methodically. The offshore accounts Gloria had discovered, the forged signature documents, the business partnerships that proved Margaret's equal ownership status. Your Honor, Mrs. Hayes was unaware that her signature had been forged on documents committing her to over $30 million in business obligations. This isn't the behavior of a dependent spouse. This is systematic fraud against a business partner. Richard's attorney, James Webb, stood to respond. Your Honor, my client denies any wrongdoing. Mrs. Hayes was fully aware of all business activities and participated willingly in all transactions. Mr. Webb, if Mrs. Hayes participated willingly in business decisions, how do you explain your client's claim that she's mentally unfit to make business decisions? Webb looked trapped. Your Honor, Mrs. Hayes's recent behavior suggests emotional instability that affects her judgment. What recent behavior? Having intimate dinners with her husband's business competitors while divorce proceedings are active. Margaret felt her face flush, but Catherine smiled. Your Honor, Mr. Webb just described a business meeting between two successful entrepreneurs. If Mrs. Hayes is mentally unfit to have business dinners, how was she mentally fit to be listed as equal partner on business loan applications as recently as last month? Judge Williams looked at Richard's attorney with obvious irritation. Mr. Webb, you can't claim Mrs. Hayes was competent enough to guarantee business loans, but incompetent to attend business meetings. Choose a position and stick with it. Your Honor, I'd like to call Margaret Hayes to testify. Margaret stood and walked to the witness stand, feeling hundreds of eyes on her. This was her moment to reclaim her identity after years of being defined by her relationship to Richard. Mrs. Hayes, did you sign loan documents for the Henderson property development? No, I did not. I wasn't even aware the project existed until yesterday. Did you authorize your husband to sign your name on business documents? Never. I would never give anyone permission to forge my signature. Mrs. Hayes, what was your role in Hayes Restaurant Group? I was co-founder and equal partner. I handled marketing, investor relations, financial planning, and strategic development for 22 years. And did you receive equal compensation for this work? No. Richard paid me a salary as an employee, not my entitled share as an equal partner. Mrs. Hayes, did you willingly participate in hiding assets from the IRS? I had no knowledge of any hidden assets. Richard handled what he called the complex financial arrangements. I trusted him because I thought we were partners. Webb cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Margaret as a pampered housewife who'd occasionally helped with social events. But every question backfired because Margaret could cite specific business decisions she'd made and deals she'd negotiated. Mrs. Hayes, isn't it true that you mainly focused on decorating restaurants and planning parties? Mr. Webb, I negotiated the lease agreements for 12 restaurant locations, designed the marketing campaigns that increased revenue by 40% over 5 years, and personally secured the financing for our expansion into entertainment venues. If you consider that decorating and party planning, then yes. Judge Williams interrupted Webb's questioning. Mr. Webb, I've heard enough. Mrs. Hayes clearly has extensive business knowledge and decision-making experience. Your client's claim that she's mentally unfit is not supported by evidence. Your Honor, we request a recess to review our position. Motion denied. Mr. Webb, call your next witness or rest your case. Your Honor, I call Richard Hayes to the stand. Richard walked to the witness stand with forced confidence, but Margaret could see sweat on his forehead. Mr. Hayes, did you forge your wife's signature on business documents? No. Margaret was aware of all business activities. Mr. Hayes, what was your wife's role in your businesses? Margaret helped with social functions and administrative tasks. She wasn't involved in major financial decisions. Catherine stood for cross-examination with the expression of a shark who'd scented blood. Mr. Hayes, you just testified that your wife wasn't involved in major financial decisions. Is that correct? Yes. Mr. Hayes, I'm showing you loan application documents from last month listing Margaret Hayes as equal decision maker and guarantor for $12 million. Did she make this major financial decision or not? Richard's attorney tried to object, but Judge Williams overruled him. Answer the question. Mr. Hayes, the loan applications required both signatures for the amount we needed. So your wife was competent to guarantee $12 million in loans, but incompetent to have dinner with potential business partners. That's different. How is it different? Mr. Hayes, Margaret doesn't understand the competitive dynamics between my company and Harrison Industries, but she understood the competitive dynamics well enough to be listed as equal partner on documents you filed to compete for major contracts. Richard was sweating visibly now. Margaret's understanding of the business evolved over time. When did it evolve? Mr. Hayes, before or after you decided to divorce her? Objection. Overruled. Answer the question. Margaret's role in the business became more limited as we grew larger. More limited, Mr. Hayes. I'm showing you emails from last week where you asked your wife to negotiate with suppliers because, and I quote, Margaret has better relationships with vendors than anyone on our team. Does that sound like a limited role? Richard looked trapped. Every answer was contradicting his claim that Margaret was an uninvolved spouse. Mr. Hayes, one final question. Do you believe your wife deserves half of the business empire you built together? I built the businesses. Margaret helped, but the success was primarily my achievement. No further questions. Your Honor. Judge Williams looked at Richard with obvious disgust. Mr. Hayes, you may step down. I've heard enough contradictory testimony to last a lifetime. Margaret watched Richard return to his seat, his confidence completely shattered. This court finds that Mr. Richard Hayes has been systematically deceiving both his wife and business partner about her legal rights and financial interests. All business assets are hereby frozen pending a full investigation by forensic accountants. Judge Williams banged her gavel with authority. Furthermore, Mrs. Hayes is appointed temporary CEO of all business entities pending completion of divorce proceedings. Mr. Hayes, you are prohibited from conducting any business activities or accessing any business accounts until further notice. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors. Richard's face went white as he realized what had just happened. Margaret Hayes had just won control of a $50 million empire from her millionaire ex-husband. But more importantly, she'd won back her identity as a successful businesswoman rather than someone's abandoned wife. As she left the courthouse, Margaret felt like she was walking taller. The narcissistic abuse was over. The financial independence was beginning. And for the first time in years, she was excited about her future. The next morning, Margaret walked into the headquarters of Hayes Restaurant Group as its court-appointed CEO. The same building she'd visited countless times as Richard's wife now belonged to her as the rightful business owner. The security guard who'd always greeted her as Mrs. Hayes now stood straighter and said, "Good morning, Miss Hayes. The executive team is waiting in the conference room." The conference room was packed with nervous executives, department heads, and senior managers. These were people Margaret had worked with for years, but always in Richard's shadow. Now they were looking to her for leadership. "I know this situation is unprecedented," Margaret began, but I want to assure everyone that business will continue normally. I've been involved in the strategic direction of this company for 22 years. The only difference now is that my involvement is official rather than unofficial. Tom Bradley, the head of development, raised his hand tentatively. Ms. Hayes, what about the pending contracts? Several require Richard's signature. Tom, as of yesterday, I have full signatory authority on all business accounts and contracts. Send me everything that needs approval, and I'll review it this afternoon. Margaret spent the morning reviewing financial reports that painted a clearer picture of Richard's deception. Not only had he been hiding assets from her, he'd been mismanaging the businesses. Several restaurants were losing money due to poor location choices. The entertainment division was hemorrhaging cash on vanity projects. The development arm was over-leveraged on speculative properties. Her assistant, Jennifer, knocked on the door. Ms. Hayes, Edward Harrison is here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he said it was urgent. Send him in. Edward entered with the kind of confidence that came from years of successful deal-making, but his expression was serious. Margaret, we have a situation. Richard's been making calls to your major investors and suppliers. Hey, what kind of calls? He's claiming you're having a nervous breakdown and that the court order is temporary. He's trying to convince people to honor only his authority and ignore your directives. Margaret felt her anger rising. Can he do that legally? No, but he can create enough confusion to disrupt your operations. More importantly, he's spreading rumors about our relationship to undermine your credibility. What kind of rumors? That you've been feeding confidential business information to Harrison Industries for years. That your dinner the other night was just the latest in a series of secret meetings. He's trying to paint you as a corporate spy who betrayed your own company. Margaret sat down heavily. Edward, maybe we should postpone any business discussions until after the divorce is final. Margaret, that's exactly what Richard wants. He's trying to isolate you from potential allies and make you believe you have to fight this battle alone. Don't I? Not if you don't want to. Margaret, I meant what I said about the partnership opportunity. But even if you're not interested in that, I have resources that can help you fight Richard's campaign of character assassination. Margaret looked at Edward carefully. What kind of resources? Public relations expertise, business intelligence, financial analysts who can demonstrate that your leadership decisions are improving company performance rather than damaging it. Why would you help me? Because Richard's been playing dirty business games for 20 years, and it's time someone called him on it. Because you're obviously the more competent business operator, and the industry will benefit from your success. And because, he paused, because what? Because I care about you, Margaret, not just as a business opportunity, but as a person who deserves better than what Richard put you through. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. It had been years since anyone had expressed genuine concern for her well-being, rather than just her usefulness. Edward, if we work together to fight Richard, what happens between us personally? Whatever you want to happen. I'm not Richard. Margaret, I don't need to own you to value you. Before Margaret could respond, Jennifer knocked again. Ms. Hayes, there's a problem. The restaurant managers are calling because suppliers are refusing to honor orders. They're saying they need Richard's personal authorization. Margaret stood up. Get me a list of every supplier account. I'm going to make some calls. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret systematically contacted every major supplier, landlord, and service provider. Most were genuinely confused about the legal situation. Once she explained the court order and faxed copies of her authorization documents, most agreed to honor her authority. But 3 major suppliers refused, claiming they had exclusive contracts with Richard personally rather than with the company. When Margaret checked the contracts, she discovered another layer of Richard's deception. He'd been signing personal service agreements that bypassed the corporate structure, making himself individually indispensable. This is actually good news, Edward said when she explained the situation. Personal service contracts signed without board approval are illegal if he was using corporate funds to pay for them. How is that good news? We can't operate restaurants without food suppliers. Because I can provide alternative suppliers immediately, and we can sue Richard for breach of fiduciary duty for signing unauthorized personal contracts. Margaret looked at Edward with new appreciation. You really have thought this through. Margaret, I've been waiting 20 years for an opportunity to compete with Richard on equal terms. Now I have something better. I have the chance to partner with the person who was really running his operation all along. That afternoon, Margaret made the decision that would define her new life. She accepted Edward's partnership proposal, not just for business reasons, but because she was ready to build something with someone who saw her as an equal. But first, she had to finish dismantling Richard's attempts to sabotage her company. Margaret called an emergency staff meeting for 5 o'clock. "I want everyone to understand the situation clearly," she announced to the assembled managers. "Richard Hayes is no longer authorized to make any business decisions for this company. Anyone who follows his directions instead of mine will be terminated immediately." Sarah Chen, the marketing director, raised her hand. "Ms. Hayes, what if Richard contacts our advertising agencies directly? Sarah, call every agency and service provider we work with. Explain that I'm the authorized CEO and that any contracts or changes must go through me. If Richard contacts them, they should refer him to our legal department." "What legal department?" asked Tom Bradley. "The one I'm hiring tomorrow. We're going to need our own attorneys to handle the transition and protect us from Richard's interference." As the meeting ended, Margaret realized she was energized rather than exhausted. For years, she'd been implementing Richard's decisions and fixing his mistakes. Now she was making her own decisions and taking responsibility for her own successes. Edward waited in her office after the staff meeting ended. "How do you feel about your first day as CEO? Like I should have done this years ago. Any regrets about the partnership offer?" Margaret looked out the window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the evening darkness. "Edward, I spent 22 years building someone else's dream while my own dreams stayed buried. I'm not making that mistake again." "What are your dreams?" "Margaret, to build the most successful hospitality empire on the West Coast, to prove that women supporting women can accomplish more than narcissistic abuse ever destroyed, to show other women what financial independence looks like. Those are big dreams. I'm ready for big dreams. The question is, are you ready to be equal partners with a woman who's just discovered how much she's capable of?" Edward smiled. "Margaret, I've been ready for that partnership my entire career." As they shook hands on their new business relationship, Margaret realized she wasn't just gaining a business partner. She was gaining an ally who respected her intelligence and supported her ambitions. The war with her millionaire ex-husband was far from over, but for the first time, Margaret Hayes felt like she was fighting from a position of strength rather than desperation. 3 weeks after taking control of Hayes Restaurant Group, Margaret was working late in her new corner office when Jennifer knocked urgently. "Ms. Hayes, there's a situation. Channel 7 News is running a story about you and Mr. Harrison." Margaret turned on the television to see a reporter standing outside the restaurant headquarters. Sources close to the Hayes divorce case suggest that Margaret Hayes has been conducting an affair with business rival Edward Harrison for over 2 years, potentially compromising confidential business information and violating her fiduciary duties as a company officer. The story was devastating. Anonymous sources claim Margaret had been secretly meeting with Edward at hotels throughout California. Phone records allegedly showed hundreds of calls between them. Business documents were supposedly missing from Hayes Restaurant Group files. Margaret's phone immediately started ringing. Reporters, board members, employees, friends, everyone wanted to know if the allegations were true. But the call that worried her most came from Catherine Morrison. "Margaret, we have a problem. Richard's attorney is filing an emergency motion claiming you're unfit to serve as CEO due to conflicts of interest and breach of fiduciary duty." "But none of it's true, Catherine." "That doesn't matter in the short term. The court could remove you as CEO pending investigation, which would give Richard exactly what he wants." "What do we do?" "We fight back immediately. I need you to document every interaction you've had with Edward Harrison, phone calls, meetings, business discussions, everything." Within an hour, Margaret had compiled a timeline that showed her relationship with Edward was entirely professional until after Richard filed for divorce. But she knew the truth was less important than the perception Richard was creating. Edward arrived at her office at 10 that evening, looking grim. "Margaret, I'm sorry. This is my fault. How is Richard's lying campaign your fault?" "Because I pushed for the partnership too quickly. I gave him ammunition to use against you." "Edward, we haven't done anything wrong." Wrong doesn't matter. Richard's playing a different game. He's not trying to win a fair fight. He's trying to destroy your reputation so thoroughly that even if you win legally, you lose professionally. Margaret felt the weight of the attack settling on her shoulders. Maybe I should step back from the partnership until after the divorce is final? Margaret, that's exactly what Richard wants. He wants you isolated, defensive, and questioning your own judgment. But if the partnership is hurting my position, the partnership is the only thing protecting your position. Without allies, you're vulnerable to exactly this kind of character assassination. Edward pulled out a folder of documents. Margaret, there's something you need to see. Richard's not just attacking you. He's been systematically contacting your employees, trying to recruit them for a competing company he's planning to start. He's what? 3 of your best managers have been offered jobs at Hayes Hospitality Solutions starting next month. Richard's trying to gut your company while fighting you in court. Margaret felt sick. Can he do that legally? Probably not, but he can do a lot of damage before we stop him. Margaret, this isn't just about the divorce anymore. Richard's trying to destroy you personally and professionally. Then what do you suggest? We go nuclear. Full investigative accounting of every transaction Richard's made in the past 5 years? Criminal referrals for any fraud we find? A public relations campaign that exposes his business practices? We stop playing defense and start playing offense. Margaret thought about the shared experience she was having with countless other women. How many successful women had faced this exact situation? A narcissistic partner trying to destroy them when they finally stood up for themselves? The pattern was as old as business itself. But that didn't make it any less devastating. Edward, if we do this, if we really go to war with Richard, what happens to us personally? I don't know, but I know what happens if we don't fight back. He wins. He gets away with 20 years of lying and stealing. And brilliant women like you continue to believe they're powerless. I'm not powerless. I know you're not. But do you believe it? Margaret looked out at the city lights, thinking about all the years she'd spent believing her value came from being Richard's wife rather than from her own abilities. Yes, I believe it, and I'm ready to prove it. Then tomorrow we start the real war. The next morning brought a coordinated attack from Margaret and Edward's combined resources. Forensic accountants descended on Hayes Restaurant Group to document every financial irregularity from Richard's management. Private investigators began tracking his attempts to recruit employees and steal business opportunities. Public relations specialists started crafting a narrative that positioned Margaret as the victim of a calculated business conspiracy. But the most effective weapon was Margaret herself. Instead of hiding from the media attention, she scheduled a press conference for that afternoon. I want to address the allegations about my relationship with Edward Harrison directly, she told the assembled reporters. Mr. Harrison and I have had a professional business relationship for 20 years. We have had exactly 2 personal dinners, both after my husband filed for divorce and moved out of our family home. Mrs. Hayes, are you denying any romantic relationship with Mr. Harrison? I'm saying that my personal life is not the issue here. The issue is that my millionaire ex-husband has been systematically stealing from companies I co-founded and legally co-own. What evidence do you have of theft? Offshore accounts worth $50 million that were funded with community property, forged signatures on business documents, hidden real estate purchases, all documented and filed with the court? Mrs. Hayes, how do you respond to allegations that you've been sharing confidential business information with a competitor? I respond by pointing out that those allegations come from a man who's currently under investigation for tax fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Richard Hayes is trying to distract from his own criminal behavior by attacking my character. The press conference shifted the narrative from Margaret as unfaithful wife to Margaret as defrauded business partner. By evening, the business news was running stories about corporate fraud rather than extramarital affairs, but Richard wasn't finished. That night, Margaret received a call that chilled her to the bone. Margaret, this is Detective Rodriguez with the LAPD. We've received a complaint that you've been embezzling funds from Hayes Restaurant Group. That's impossible. I just gained control of the company 3 weeks ago. Ma'am, the complaint alleges that you've been stealing funds for over 2 years through a series of shell companies. We're going to need you to come in for questioning. Margaret hung up and immediately called Catherine Morrison. Catherine, Richard just filed criminal charges against me for embezzlement. He what? Police want me to come in for questioning about shell companies I've supposedly been using to steal money. Margaret, don't say anything to anyone until I get there. This is Richard's final desperate move. He's trying to get you arrested to remove you as CEO. Can he do that? Not if we're smarter than he is. Margaret, I need you to gather every financial document from the past 5 years. Every bank statement, every business expense, every transaction record. We're going to prove that if anyone was running shell companies, it was Richard. As Margaret spent the night compiling financial records, she realized this was the moment of truth. Richard had escalated beyond character assassination to attempted criminal framing. He was betting that she would be too intimidated to fight back effectively. But Margaret Hayes was no longer the woman who'd answered the phone in her kitchen 3 weeks ago. She was a CEO who'd discovered her own power, a business partner who'd found an equal ally, and a woman who'd stopped believing she needed anyone's permission to claim what was rightfully hers. The war with her millionaire ex-husband was about to reach its climax, and Margaret was ready to finish what he'd started. The police interview lasted 6 hours. Margaret sat in a sterile interrogation room with Catherine Morrison, while Detective Rodriguez went through allegations that painted her as a sophisticated embezzler who'd been stealing from her own company for years. Mrs. Hayes, can you explain these transfers to Global Hospitality Solutions? Margaret looked at the bank records and felt her blood run cold. Someone had been transferring money from Hayes Restaurant Group to a company she'd never heard of. The signatures looked like hers, but she'd never authorized any such transfers. Detective, I've never seen these transactions before. I've never heard of Global Hospitality Solutions. Mrs. Hayes, your signature is on every authorization. Catherine leaned forward. Detective, my client has reason to believe her signature has been forged on numerous business documents. We'd like to request handwriting analysis on these authorizations. That can be arranged. Mrs. Hayes, can you explain your relationship with this company? I don't have a relationship with them. I don't even know what they do. Detective Rodriguez showed her more documents. Credit card charges to Global Hospitality Solutions for consulting services. Payments for marketing analysis. Equipment rentals. Over 2 years, nearly $3 million had been transferred to this mysterious company. Mrs. Hayes, if you weren't authorizing these payments, who was? Margaret looked at the dates on the transactions. They all occurred during periods when Richard had been handling what he called complex financial arrangements that he said were too complicated for her to understand. Detective, I believe my husband was forging my signature to steal money from our company and framing me for the theft. That's a serious accusation. Mrs. Hayes, it's a provable accusation, Catherine interjected. Detective, we'd like to request a full investigation of Global Hospitality Solutions, corporate records, bank accounts, ownership structure. I suspect you'll find that Richard Hayes is the actual owner of the shell company. The investigation took 2 weeks. During that time, Margaret was suspended as CEO pending resolution of the criminal allegations. Richard's attorney immediately petitioned the court to reinstall Richard as head of the company, claiming Margaret's suspension proved she was unfit for leadership, but Catherine Morrison had been busy. While Richard was celebrating his apparent victory, forensic accountants were tracing every dollar that had flowed through Global Hospitality Solutions. The results were devastating for Richard's credibility. Global Hospitality Solutions was owned by Ashley Chen, Richard's pregnant secretary. The company had no employees, no office, and no legitimate business operations. It existed solely to receive money stolen from Hayes Restaurant Group. The money had been used to purchase the Cayman Islands properties, fund Richard's personal expenses, and even pay for Ashley's medical bills and maternity expenses. Your Honor, Catherine said at the emergency hearing, we can prove that Richard Hayes created a shell company owned by his mistress to embezzle money from the business he co-owns with his wife. He then forged Mrs. Hayes' signature on the authorization documents and filed false criminal charges against her to cover up his own theft. Judge Williams looked at the evidence with obvious disgust. Mr. Webb, how does your client explain the bank records showing him as the beneficial owner of Global Hospitality Solutions? Your Honor, my client was protecting business assets during the marital dissolution. By stealing $3 million and framing his business partner for the theft, Your Honor, the financial arrangements were complex. Mr. Webb, there's nothing complex about embezzlement and forgery. Your client has committed multiple felonies. The hearing lasted all day. Witness after witness testified about Richard's deceptive business practices. Gloria, the accountant, presented evidence of systematic tax fraud. Edward Harrison testified about Richard's attempts to recruit employees for his competing business. Several restaurant managers testified about Richard's orders to ignore Margaret's authority. But the most damaging testimony came from Ashley Chen herself. Under subpoena, Ashley admitted that she'd never performed any services for Global Hospitality Solutions. The company existed only to receive money that Richard told her came from legitimate business reorganization. She'd signed documents she didn't understand and followed Richard's instructions without questioning their legality. Miss Chen, did you know that the money you received through Global Hospitality Solutions was being stolen from Mrs. Hayes? No, I thought it was Richard's money to give. Miss Chen, did Richard ever tell you that Mrs. Hayes was his business partner rather than just his wife? No, he always said she was just a housewife who didn't understand business. Miss Chen, did you participate in any actual business activities for Global Hospitality Solutions? No, I just signed papers when Richard told me to. By the end of Ashley's testimony, it was clear that she'd been used as a pawn in Richard's embezzlement scheme, just as much as Margaret had been victimized by his deception. Judge Williams called for a recess before delivering her ruling. This court has heard evidence of systematic fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and perjury by Richard Hayes. Mr. Hayes, you are hereby found in contempt of court for filing false criminal charges against your business partner. Richard's face went white as the judge continued. Furthermore, this court is referring evidence of criminal behavior to the district attorney for potential prosecution. All business assets are permanently awarded to Margaret Hayes as compensation for damages and theft. Your Honor, Richard's attorney interrupted. My client requests the opportunity to settle this matter privately. Mr. Webb, your client lost the opportunity for private settlement when he decided to commit crimes. Mrs. Hayes, you are reinstated as CEO with full authority over all business operations. Margaret felt tears of relief running down her cheeks. After months of fighting, she'd not only won her divorce settlement, she'd gained complete control of the empire she'd helped build. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. Mr. Hayes, you are ordered to transfer all business interests to Mrs. Hayes immediately. You are banned from participating in any competing business in California for 5 years, and you will remain in custody pending criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Richard was led away in handcuffs while news cameras captured his humiliation. The man who'd tried to destroy Margaret's reputation was ending his career as a convicted criminal. As Margaret left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about her plans for the business empire she'd just inherited. I'm going to build something better than what existed before, she said. Something based on partnership rather than deception. Something that proves women supporting women can accomplish more than narcissistic abuse ever destroyed. Mrs. Hayes, what's your message to other women going through similar situations? Margaret paused, thinking about all the women who might be listening to her story. Women discovering their own strength after years of being underestimated. Women learning that financial independence was possible even after devastating betrayal. My message is that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest gift life can give you. When people assume you're powerless, they stop watching for your strength. Use that advantage. Fight for what's yours. And remember that the moment you feel most defeated might actually be the moment you're about to discover how powerful you really are. As Margaret walked away from the courthouse, she wasn't just leaving behind her divorce proceedings. She was walking toward a future she'd built entirely on her own terms. 6 months after Richard's conviction for embezzlement and fraud, Margaret stood in the boardroom of Hayes Holdings, looking out at the Pacific Ocean from the 40th floor of her new headquarters building. The business empire she'd inherited had been transformed beyond recognition. Edward Harrison sat across the conference table, reviewing acquisition proposals for their expanded hospitality group. The Santa Barbara resort deal just closed, he reported. Congratulations. You now own the largest luxury hotel chain on the West Coast. We own, Margaret corrected. Equal partners. Remember, The merger of Hayes Holdings and Harrison Industries had exceeded both their expectations. Combined, they controlled over $200 million in hospitality assets, from restaurants to hotels to entertainment venues. But more importantly, Margaret had discovered her true calling as a business visionary rather than someone's support system. Any word on the final settlement from Richard's criminal case? His attorney called this morning. Richards agreed to forfeit all remaining assets in exchange for avoiding additional federal charges. That includes the Cayman Islands properties and the yacht he thought he'd hidden successfully. Margaret nodded. And Ashley received probation in exchange for her testimony. She's apparently using the money she has left to go back to school for accounting, wants to understand financial documents so she can never be deceived again. Margaret felt a surprising sympathy for Ashley. Like Margaret herself, Ashley had been a victim of Richard's manipulation, just in a different way. Edward, I've been thinking about our expansion plans. What kind of thinking? I want to create something more than just a hospitality empire. I want to build a company that demonstrates what's possible when business is conducted with integrity instead of narcissistic abuse. What would that look like? Equal pay policies, profit sharing with all employees, mentorship programs for women entering business, transparency in all financial dealings, a corporate culture based on supporting people's success rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities. Edward smiled. Margaret, you're talking about revolutionizing how business is done. I'm talking about proving that financial independence doesn't require stepping on other people, that you can build an empire without destroying the people who help you create it. Anon, the conference room door opened, and Jennifer entered with a stack of messages. Ms. Hayes, you have interview requests from 3 business magazines, 2 potential investors wanting to schedule meetings, and the mayor's office called about the downtown development project. Schedule the investors for tomorrow. Accept the magazine interviews, and put the mayor through when she calls back. As Jennifer left, Margaret turned to Edward. Any regrets about partnering with a woman who's determined to change how business works? Margaret, my only regret is that it took 20 years for us to have this opportunity. Speaking of opportunities, there's something else we need to discuss. What's that? Us? Personally? Edward's expression became serious. What about us? I've been thinking about your marriage proposal from last month. And I realized something. For 22 years, I defined myself as someone's wife. Then for the past year, I've been defining myself as someone's business partner. But I've never really defined myself as just Margaret Hayes, independent person. Are you saying you're not ready for marriage? I'm saying I'm ready for a different kind of marriage, one where both people maintain their individual identities while choosing to build something together. What would that look like? Separate bank accounts alongside joint investments? Individual career goals alongside shared business ventures? Personal independence alongside emotional partnership? Edward considered this. Margaret, are you asking me to marry an equal rather than acquire a wife? I'm asking if you're capable of loving someone who doesn't need you, but chooses to be with you anyway. I've been waiting my entire life for that opportunity. Margaret felt something settle in her chest. For the first time since her original marriage, she was considering partnership from a position of strength rather than need. Edward, ask me again in 6 months. What happens in 6 months? In 6 months, I'll have proven to myself that I can run this empire successfully on my own. And then maybe I'll be ready to share that success with someone who appreciates it rather than taking credit for it. What if I can't wait 6 months? Margaret laughed. Edward, if you can't wait 6 months, you're not the partner I thought you were. Fair enough. Margaret Hayes, will you consider marrying me in 6 months, assuming we're both still interested in equal partnership? I'll consider it seriously. They shook hands across the conference table, and Margaret realized she was negotiating the terms of her personal life with the same confidence she brought to business deals. Her phone buzzed with a text from Susan. Saw you on the business news again. You look happier than I've seen you in 20 years. Margaret typed back. I feel like myself for the first time in 20 years. As the sun set over the Pacific, Margaret reviewed the proposals that would define the next phase of her business empire. Hotel acquisitions in 3 states, restaurant chains in major metropolitan areas, entertainment venues that would employ thousands of people. But more than expanding her financial success, Margaret was building something that had never existed before. A business empire that proved women supporting women could accomplish more than any individual success story. She thought about all the women who might be watching her transformation. Women trapped in relationships that diminished their potential. Women who'd forgotten their own capabilities while building someone else's dreams. Women who believed their value came from being useful to others rather than from their own inherent worth. Margaret hoped they would see her story and remember that it's never too late to reclaim your own power. That financial independence is possible even after devastating betrayal. That the moment when your life seems most destroyed might actually be the moment when your real life begins. Margaret Hayes had spent 22 years as someone's wife, 8 months fighting for what was hers, and now she was building a future entirely on her own terms. And she was just getting started. 1 year after Richard's conviction, Margaret Hayes stood before the California Women's Business Association as their keynote speaker. The ballroom was packed with entrepreneurs, executives, and women at every stage of building their own financial independence. 2 years ago, Margaret began, I answered my phone in my kitchen and received news that destroyed my marriage, my identity, and everything I thought I knew about my life. Today, I'm the CEO of a $200 million hospitality empire that employs 3,000 people across 5 states. The audience applauded, but Margaret held up her hand. But this isn't a story about revenge against a millionaire ex-husband, although that certainly happened. This is a story about remembering who you were before you became who someone else needed you to be. Margaret shared her journey from abandoned wife to successful CEO, emphasizing the moments when she'd had to choose between accepting victim status and fighting for her rightful power. The most important lesson I learned is that narcissistic abuse thrives on making you forget your own capabilities. When Richard was stealing from our company, he convinced me that I didn't understand the complex financial arrangements. When he was having an affair, he convinced me that I was being paranoid and jealous. When he tried to steal my business, he convinced everyone that I was just a dependent housewife. A woman in the audience raised her hand. Ms. Hayes, how did you find the courage to fight back when everything seemed hopeless? I found documentation that proved I was never actually powerless. I had always been an equal partner, co-owner, and decision maker. I just had to remember that legal reality and stop accepting his version of who I was. Another hand went up. What advice do you have for women who are afraid to leave abusive situations because of financial dependence? Margaret paused, thinking about the shared experience that connected every woman in the room. Document everything. Keep copies of all financial records, business documents, and evidence of your contributions to any shared assets. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not entitled to what you've helped build. And remember that being underestimated is actually an advantage. When people assume you're powerless, they become careless about hiding their own weaknesses. Miss Hayes, what's your message about women supporting women in business? That it's not just morally right, it's strategically smart. When women collaborate instead of competing, we build stronger businesses and create opportunities that benefit everyone. My partnership with the women in my company, my alliance with my attorney, my friendship with my accountant, those relationships were what gave me the strength to fight for what was mine. After the speech, Margaret was approached by dozens of women with their own stories. Wives discovering hidden assets, business partners being marginalized by male colleagues, entrepreneurs struggling to access capital because investors didn't take them seriously. Margaret listened to each story and offered practical advice. But more importantly, she reminded each woman that they already possessed the intelligence and determination needed to succeed. They just needed permission to believe in themselves. That evening, Margaret returned to her Malibu home, the same house where she'd received the devastating phone call that started her transformation. But now it felt completely different. Instead of a shrine to someone else's success, it was the sanctuary of a woman who'd built her own empire. Edward arrived for dinner carrying champagne and a small velvet box. Is that what I think it is? Margaret asked. That depends on whether you're ready to give me an answer to the question I asked 6 months ago. Margaret had spent the day thinking about how far she'd traveled from the woman who'd defined herself entirely through her relationship to Richard. She'd built a successful business, created financial independence, and discovered capabilities she'd forgotten she possessed. Most importantly, she'd learned the difference between needing someone and choosing someone. Edward, I'm ready to give you an answer. And yes, I'll marry you. But I have conditions. Edward laughed. Of course you do. What are they? We maintain separate business entities, even though we're married. I keep my own name. We both retain the right to make major life decisions independently. And if you ever try to diminish my professional accomplishments or take credit for my success, I'll divorce you and take half of everything you own. Those are some serious conditions. I'm a serious woman who's learned not to give up her power for anyone. Margaret Hayes, I wouldn't want you any other way. As they celebrated their engagement, Margaret reflected on the wisdom she'd gained through her transformation. She'd learned that financial independence wasn't just about money. It was about remembering that you have choices even when someone tries to convince you that you don't. She'd learned that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest gift life could give you, because it meant people stopped watching for your strength. Most importantly, she'd learned that it's never too late to reclaim your own story and start writing the chapters you actually want to live. Margaret's phone rang, and she saw it was a call from a reporter working on a follow-up story about her business success. Ms. Hayes, what's next for your company? We're expanding internationally, opening hotels in London and Tokyo, creating a business school specifically for women entrepreneurs, and launching a foundation that provides legal and financial support for women fighting business fraud. What's your ultimate goal? Margaret looked at Edward, who was reviewing expansion plans while wearing the smile of a man who'd found an equal partner rather than a dependent spouse. My goal is to prove that when women remember their own power and support each other's success, we can build something better than what existed before. Something based on partnership rather than domination. Something that shows other women what's possible when they stop accepting less than they deserve. Any final thoughts for women who might be listening? Margaret paused, thinking about all the women who might be sitting in kitchens right now, receiving devastating phone calls that would either destroy them or transform them. I want them to know that the moment when you feel most powerless might actually be the moment when you're about to discover just how strong you really are. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not capable of building your own empire. Don't accept crumbs from a table you helped set. And remember that being someone's wife or partner should add to your life, not replace it. After hanging up, Margaret walked out to the deck overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The same view she'd stared at 2 years ago when her world collapsed was now the backdrop for a life she'd built entirely on her own terms. Edward joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Any regrets about how everything turned out? Margaret considered the question seriously. Richard was serving 5 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. Ashley had graduated with her accounting degree and was working for a nonprofit organization helping women understand financial documents. The business empire Margaret had inherited was thriving under her leadership. No regrets, she said finally. Richard did me the biggest favor of my life when he filed those divorce papers. He forced me to stop being his wife and start being myself. What do you think you'd say to your younger self if you could go back to that morning in the kitchen? I'd tell her that the phone call she's about to receive isn't the end of her story. It's the beginning of the story she was always meant to write. Margaret thought about the universal truth that connected her experience to countless other women's stories. How many brilliant, capable women were living smaller lives than they deserved because they'd been convinced their value came from supporting someone else's dreams. How many were accepting financial dependence instead of claiming the independence they'd earned? How many were tolerating narcissistic abuse because they'd forgotten they had other options? Edward, do you know what the best part of our relationship is? What's that? You fell in love with me after I'd already proven I didn't need you. You chose a partner, not a dependent. And you chose someone who appreciates your strength instead of feeling threatened by it. As the sun set over the Pacific, Margaret Hayes felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who'd reclaimed her own power and used it to build something extraordinary. She'd transformed from victim to victor, from dependent wife to independent CEO, from someone who answered to a millionaire ex-husband to someone who employed 3,000 people and controlled her own destiny. But more than her personal success, Margaret had created a legacy that would inspire other women to recognize their own strength. Through her business practices, her foundation, and her example, she was proving that women supporting women could accomplish more than any individual achievement. The little girl who'd once dreamed of running her own business had finally grown up to become the woman she was always meant to be. And the best part was, She was just getting started. In boardrooms across California, women were negotiating better deals because they'd heard Margaret's story. In divorce courts, wives were demanding fair settlements because they'd learned about partnership documents and hidden assets. In business schools, female students were studying Margaret's transformation as proof that financial independence was possible even after devastating betrayal. Margaret Hayes had become more than a successful CEO. She'd become a symbol of what happened when women stopped accepting less than they deserved and started claiming everything they'd earned. And as she stood on her deck, looking out at the limitless ocean, Margaret knew that her greatest accomplishment wasn't the empire she'd built or the fortune she'd accumulated. Her greatest accomplishment was remembering who she'd always been underneath all the roles she'd played for other people. She was Margaret Hayes, businesswoman, leader, and architect of her own extraordinary life. The phone call that had destroyed her marriage had actually saved her soul, and for that unexpected gift, she would be grateful for the rest of her life.